Have you ever purchased your dream property only to have someone else try to tell you what you can and can't do with it? Well, buckle up, because today I'm sharing the unbelievable story of how a power-hungry HOA president and her self-appointed security team tried to claim jurisdiction over my ranch, property that wasn't even part of their association. But they had no idea who they were messing with, and the consequences would change the entire valley forever. If you've ever dealt with overreaching authority figures or neighborhood tyrants, you're going to love how this story ends. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months ago, I finally achieved my lifelong dream, purchasing a 35-acre ranch on the outskirts of Silver Creek Valley. After 20 years of military service, followed by a decade building my security consulting business, I'd saved enough to buy this perfect piece of land, with rolling pastures, a small creek running through it, and the mountains framing the backdrop. It was everything I'd ever wanted. The property sat just outside the boundary of the affluent Silver Creek Estates subdivision, which meant I'd have neighbors within a reasonable distance, but plenty of privacy. At least, that's what I thought. The ranch had been vacant for nearly 2 years before I purchased it. The previous owner had passed away, and his children, living out of state, had little interest in maintaining the property. It needed work. The fencing was broken in places, the barn roof needed repairs, and the modest ranch house required some serious updating. But I saw the potential and dove headfirst into renovations, excited to build the life I'd always imagined. The trouble began 3 weeks after I moved in. I was repairing a section of fence along the western edge of my property when an electric golf cart came buzzing up the dirt road that separated my land from Silver Creek Estates. A woman with impeccably highlighted blonde hair and oversized sunglasses pulled up, her posture rigid with self-importance. Behind her sat a man in a navy polo shirt with some kind of embroidered logo I couldn't quite make out. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're trying to sound authoritative. "We've received several complaints about the condition of this property. I'm going to need you to stop what you're doing, immediately." I straightened up, wiping my hands on my jeans, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, who are you exactly?" She tilted her head, as if surprised I didn't recognize her. "I'm Diane Holloway, president of the Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association." She gestured to the man beside her. "This is Marcus, our head of community security. We're responding to multiple violations that have been reported." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This ranch isn't in part of Silver Creek Estates. I don't belong to your HOA." Her smile tightened, lips pressed into a thin line. "Actually, according to our boundaries, this property falls within our jurisdiction. Your fence modifications don't meet our standards, and we've documented numerous other violations: the abandoned vehicles in your backfield, the unpermitted construction, the livestock that's planned to arrive next week." My blood ran cold. How did she know about the cattle delivery I'd scheduled? I'd only discussed that with the local rancher who was selling me the herd. "That information is none of your business," I said firmly. "And again, this property is not part of your association. I have the deed and property maps to prove it." Diane's perfectly manicured hand fluttered dismissively. "The previous owner had an agreement with us. This property has always been held to our standards, regardless of the technicalities. We expect the same compliance from you." Marcus, the security guy, stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "We'll need to schedule an official inspection of the premises, sir. Your cooperation would be appreciated." I planted my feet firmly, crossing my arms. "Not happening. This is private property. Unless you have actual legal authority, which I highly doubt, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Diane's expression hardened. "We don't appreciate this hostile attitude. Silver Creek Estates maintains certain standards and you're—" She glanced around disdainfully. "Project here is already affecting property values. We have ways of handling non-compliance." "Is that a threat?" I asked quietly. Her smile returned, cold and practiced. "Not at all. Just a statement of fact. We'll be in touch." As they drove away, I noticed Marcus taking photos of my property with his phone. Something told me this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding easily cleared up. The next morning, I found an official-looking envelope taped to my mailbox. Inside was a formal notice from the Silver Creek Estates HOA, listing a dozen supposed violations, from improper fencing materials to unapproved exterior color scheme, on my house, which I hadn't even painted yet. At the bottom was a fine for $2,500 and a warning that failure to remit payment would result in escalation procedures. I didn't bother responding. Instead, I called my lawyer, James Tucker, and explained the situation. He laughed outright. "They have absolutely zero jurisdiction over your property, Ethan. The ranch has never been part of Silver Creek Estates. It predates the development by about 60 years. He paused. "But this isn't the first I've heard about Diane Holloway overreaching. She's been running that HOA like a personal fiefdom for years. Most people just pay up rather than fight her." "Well, I'm not most people," I replied, "and I don't take kindly to bullying." "I know, my friend, that's why I'm worried," James said, his tone growing serious. "Diane has connections with the county commissioners. Her husband plays golf with Judge Reynolds every Sunday. Just, be careful." I thanked him and hung up, more troubled than I wanted to admit. I'd faced warlords and insurgents during my military career, navigated billion-dollar security contracts with hostile foreign governments in my business. The idea that a suburban HOA president could pose any real threat seemed laughable. Yet something about Diane's confidence unsettled me. For the next 2 days, nothing happened. I continued my repairs, met with the contractor about the barn roof, and tried to put the incident behind me. Then came the second encounter. I was unloading feed supplies from my truck when 3 vehicles pulled into my driveway. Diane's golf cart, followed by 2 white SUVs with Silver Creek Estate security magnetically attached to their doors. 6 men in those navy polos flanked. Diane, as she approached, Marcus leading the pack. "Mr. Morrison," she called out, using my name though I'd never introduced myself. "We're conducting our inspection today. Please step aside." I set down the bag of feed and stood my ground. "Ma'am, I already told you. This property isn't part of your association. You have no authority here. This is trespassing." Marcus stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Sir, we have documentation proving this land falls under Silver Creek Estates covenants. Continuing to obstruct HOA business could result in additional penalties." "Show me this documentation," I challenged. Diane's smile was triumphant as she handed over a folder. Inside was a crudely altered property map with boundary lines that had clearly been extended to encompass my ranch, along with a fake addendum to the original development plan. The forgery was so obvious, it would have been comical if it weren't. So brazen. "This is fraudulent," I stated flatly, handing it back. "You're presenting falsified documents and trespassing on private property. I'm asking you once more to leave, now." One of the security men, a stocky guy with a military-style haircut, took a step toward me. "Listen, buddy, we can do this the easy way." I cut him off with a raised hand. "Before you finish that sentence, you should know something." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my wallet, flipping it open to reveal my credentials. "I'm Ethan Morrison, owner of Sentinel Security International, former Special Forces. I train federal agents and law enforcement in tactical response. and you're currently trespassing on my property with fraudulent documents and veiled threats." The effect was instantaneous. The security men hesitated, looking to Marcus for direction. Even Diane seemed momentarily thrown off balance, though she recovered quickly. "Your background is irrelevant, Mr. Morrison," she said, voice cold. "Your property affects our community, and we have every right to ensure compliance." "No, you and don't," I replied evenly, "and right now I'm recording this entire interaction." I nodded toward the security cameras I'd installed after the first encounter. "Those cameras capture everything, including audio. Your threats, your fraudulent documents, all of it. One call from me, and the sheriff will be very interested in this footage." Marcus whispered something to Diane, who shot him an icy glare, before turning back to me. "This isn't over, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice quivering slightly with rage. "Silver Creek Estates protects its interests. Perhaps you should consider selling this property to someone more cooperative." As they retreated to their vehicles, I called after them, "Don't come back without a warrant or genuine legal authority. Next time, I'll press charges." That night, I reviewed the security footage, capturing clear images of each face, the altered documents, and every word of the conversation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I sent copies to my lawyer with instructions to file a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office. Something told me Diane wouldn't give up easily, and I needed to establish a paper trail. The next week brought a new level of harassment. Every contractor I'd scheduled suddenly cancelled without explanation. The feed delivery company called to say they couldn't service my address anymore. When I drove into town for supplies, I noticed one of those white security SUVs following me, keeping a distance but making sure I saw them. Then came the letters, not just to me, but to my neighbors in the surrounding rural properties. The HOA had sent community alerts warning about a dangerous individual who had moved into the area, claiming I was under investigation for various unspecified offenses. They included a grainy photo of me taken from a distance, making me look suspicious. My nearest neighbor, elderly rancher Frank Whitman, brought his letter over personally, his weathered face creased with concern. "Thought you should see this garbage they're spreading," he said, handing me the paper. "Nobody's buying it, son. We've all dealt with Diane and her crew before. That woman's been trying to annex every property around that development for years." Frank's support meant more than he knew. "Thanks for bringing this over. I'm sorry you got dragged into my mess." He shook his head. "Not your mess. Diane's been a thorn in our side since she moved here from California 5 years ago. Bought the biggest house in Silver Creek and immediately took over the HOA. Been hell for everyone since." He glanced around my property. "Nice place you're fixing up. Shame about Jack passing. He'd be glad someone's bringing the ranch back to life." After Frank left, I called the county sheriff's office again, adding the defamatory letters to my growing complaint. The deputy I spoke with sighed heavily. "We've received your previous reports, Mr. Morrison, but without evidence of direct threats or physical damage, there's not much we can do. HOA disputes are usually civil matters." "What about defamation and harassment?" I pressed. "They're spreading false information about me throughout the community. File for a restraining order," he suggested. "That might get their attention." Before I could follow that advice, things escalated dramatically. At approximately 2 a.m., my security system alerted me to movement near the barn. The night vision cameras showed 4 figures in dark clothing moving around the structure. They weren't even trying to be subtle. One carried what looked like a gas can. I grabbed my phone and my licensed firearm and moved silently through the house and out the back door. Years of training took over as I circled around, keeping to the shadows until I had a clear view of the intruders. They were indeed pouring something around the base of the barn. The smell of gasoline hit my nostrils as the wind shifted. "Stop right there!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the property. "Drop what you're carrying and put your hands up!" The figures froze, then scattered in different directions. I fired a single warning shot into the air, which halted two of them in their tracks. The others disappeared into the darkness. "Face down on the ground, now!" I commanded, approaching. Carefully, phone in one hand, firearm in the other. Sheriff's already been called. Security cameras caught everything. The two figures slowly complied, lying face down in the dirt. As I got closer, I recognized one of them. It was Marcus, Diane's head of security. The other was one of the men who had accompanied them during their inspection visit. "You've made a serious mistake," I told them, keeping my distance while ensuring they remained still. "Breaking and entering, attempted arson, trespassing. These are felonies, not HOA violations." Within 15 minutes, sheriff's deputies arrived, lights flashing. As they took my statement and arrested the two men, I showed them the security footage on my phone. It clearly captured all four intruders arriving in a Silver Creek Estates security vehicle. "We'll need all your camera recordings," one deputy said, suddenly much more interested than anyone had been during my previous complaints. "This changes things considerably." As the deputies led Marcus away in handcuffs, he finally broke his silence. "She said you wouldn't be here, that it would look like an accident. This wasn't supposed to happen." I knew immediately who she was. The deputy looked at me grimly. "We're going to need a full statement, and I suggest you don't stay here alone tonight, just in case there are others." I nodded, watching as they searched the perimeter of my property. "Don't worry, I've dealt with worse than Diane Holloway." But even as I said it, I realized how dangerous the situation had become. This wasn't about HOA violations anymore. Someone had just tried to burn down my barn, with my horses scheduled to arrive the next day. This meant war. The night air was thick with tension as the sheriff's deputies finished processing the crime scene around my barn. The smell of gasoline still lingered, a potent reminder of how close I'd come to losing the structure. Deputy Ramirez, who'd taken point on the investigation, approached me with a grim expression. "Mr. Morrison, we've got Marcus and his associate in custody. They're not saying much except that they were following orders. Given the circumstances, we'll need to question Ms. Holloway immediately." I nodded, watching as forensic techs collected samples from the ground. "I want to press every possible charge. This went beyond harassment the moment they brought that gas can onto my property." Ramirez's radio crackled, and he stepped away to respond. When he returned, his expression had darkened further. "There's a complication. Officers went to Diane Holloway's residence, but she's not there. Her husband claims she's on an overnight trip to visit her sister in Boulder City." "Convenient timing," I remarked, not believing it for a second. "Too convenient," Ramirez agreed. "We've put out an alert for her vehicle. In the meantime, is there somewhere else you can stay tonight?" I shook my head. "My horses are being delivered tomorrow morning. I'm not leaving them unprotected, especially not after this." After the deputies left, I walked the perimeter of my property, checking security points. The attempted arson had caught me off guard. I hadn't expected Diane's vendetta to escalate to physical destruction so quickly. Back inside, I accessed the cloud storage, where all my security footage was backed up. The cameras had captured perfect images of all four perpetrators, including clear shots of Marcus directing the operation. I compiled the footage into a comprehensive file, making copies for my lawyer, the sheriff's department, and insurance purposes. As I worked, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. "Morrison?" I answered cautiously. "Mr. Morrison, this is Jessica Chen from the Silver Creek Gazette. I'm following up on a report about arrests made at your property tonight. Would you care to comment?" I hesitated, surprised by how quickly the news had traveled. "How did you hear about this?" "Police scanner," she replied promptly. Plus, 3 separate tips from residents in Silver Creek Estates. The community grapevine was apparently efficient. Ms. Chen, I'd be happy to give you a statement, but I think this story goes deeper than what happened tonight. How familiar are you with Diane Holloway and the Silver Creek Estates HOA? There was a pause on the line. Very. I've been investigating. Complaints about them for months, but nobody's been willing to go on record. Fear of retaliation. That caught my interest. I'm not afraid of Diane Holloway. In fact, I'd be willing to share documentation of harassment, fraudulent claims of jurisdiction over my property, and now attempted arson by her security team. We arranged to meet the next morning, and I hung up, feeling a strange sense of momentum building. If Jessica had been investigating the HOA already, my situation might be just one piece of a larger pattern of abuse. Sleep was out of the question. By sunrise, I'd installed additional cameras in blind spots around the property and reinforced the locks on both the house and barn. The horse trailer arrived precisely at 6:30 a.m. The driver, a weathered man named Pete from the neighboring county, helped me unload the 3-quarter horses I'd purchased. Beautiful animals, Pete commented as we watched them explore. Shame about what happened last night. Word travels fast around these parts. Apparently so, I replied, offering him coffee before he headed back on the road. Pete accepted gratefully, leaning against his truck. You know, you're not the first to have trouble with that woman. My cousin lives in Silver Creek. Diane tried to fine him $10,000 for parking his work truck in his own driveway overnight. Said commercial vehicles violated community standards. What happened? Pete grinned. He moved. Couldn't stand it anymore. Half the original residents have left since she took over the HOA. Only the wealthy newcomers remain, plus folks too stubborn or too broke to relocate. Jessica Chen arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, a petite woman with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She carried a professional camera and a tablet for notes. "Show me everything," she said, getting straight to business. For the next hour, I walked her through the entire saga. The initial confrontation, the fraudulent documents, the escalating harassment, and finally, the attempted arson. I provided copies of every notice, photograph, and video recording. "This is consistent with what I've been hearing," she said finally. "But your case is different in one critical aspect. You have irrefutable evidence. Most residents either gave in to her demands or left before gathering enough documentation. Why hasn't anyone stood up to her before?" Jessica's expression turned grim. "Fear mostly. Diane's husband Julian is a major developer with connections throughout the county. Cross him, and suddenly your business loses permits, your renovation plans get denied, your property taxes get reassessed. What about the surrounding properties? I'm not the first non-HOA resident she's targeted, am I? Far from it. There's a pattern of harassment against properties bordering Silver Creek Estates. Several have sold under market value in the past 3 years. Care to guess who purchased them?" "Julian Holloway," I answered, seeing the scheme clearly now. Jessica nodded. "Through various shell companies. He buys the properties at depressed prices after his wife's HOA makes life unbearable for the owners, then incorporates them into expanded phases of Silver Creek Estates. The new luxury homes sell for triple what he paid for the land. My property would be prime real estate for expansion," I mused, "especially with the creek access and mountain views." "Exactly. You're sitting on several $1 million worth of development potential. Your refusal to be intimidated throws a wrench in their usual strategy." Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Looking out the window, I saw 3 Sheriff's Department cruisers pulling into my driveway, followed by an unmarked sedan. Sheriff Ellis himself stepped out of the unmarked car. I'd met him briefly after filing my initial complaints, but he'd seemed disinterested at the time. His presence now indicated the severity of the situation had finally registered. "Mr. Morrison," he greeted me, removing his sunglasses. "Mind if we come in? we have developments in your case. Once everyone was settled in my living room, the sheriff got straight to the point. We executed a search warrant at the Silver Creek Estates HOA office early this morning. What we found suggests an organized campaign of harassment and fraud that extends well beyond your property. One of the deputies handed me a folder containing photographs of documents. These were found in a locked cabinet in Diane Holloway's office. They appear to be dossiers on several properties bordering Silver Creek Estates, including detailed surveillance notes, property valuations, and what can only be described as pressure strategies for each owner. I flipped through the pages, recognizing my own property among them. The file contained personal information that should have been private. My military service record, business contacts, even health information from my VA records. This is illegal surveillance. Yes, it is, Sheriff Ellis confirmed. We've also discovered financial records indicating unusual payments from the HOA accounts to several county officials. Have you located Diane Holloway? I asked. The sheriff's expression tightened. That's the other reason we're here. Her husband now claims she never left for Boulder City. According to him, she mentioned heading to your property last night to resolve the situation once and for all. She hasn't returned home, and her vehicle is missing. A chill ran through me. She wasn't among the 4 individuals my cameras captured last night. We'll need to conduct a thorough search of your land, Mr. Morrison, Sheriff Ellis said, just to rule out any possibility that she's here. I nodded immediately. Of course, whatever you need. The next few hours were chaotic. Deputies and search dogs combed every inch of my 35 acres, focusing particularly on the wooded area near the creek and the rocky outcropping at the northern boundary. The search concluded without finding any trace of Diane Holloway. As the last, deputies were preparing to leave. Frank Whitman's ancient pickup truck came bouncing up my driveway. The old rancher looked agitated as he approached. "Ethan, been trying to call you all morning," he said, then noticed the sheriff and deputies. "What in blazes is going on here?" I quickly explained the situation while Sheriff Ellis listened with interest. Frank removed his weathered hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Well, that explains it. I saw Diane Holloway's fancy white Mercedes parked near the old mining road last night. Thought it was strange, her being out there that late. That road runs along the back of your property." Sheriff Ellis immediately radioed his team. "We need to extend the search to the old mining road north of the property, possible location of Holloway's vehicle." As they prepared to leave, my phone rang, a local number I didn't recognize. "Morrison," I answered. "Mr. Morrison, this is Julian Holloway." The voice was smooth, cultured, with an undercurrent of tension. "I believe we need to talk about my wife." "I believe we need to talk about my wife." I put the call on speaker so Sheriff Ellis could hear. "Mr. Holloway, your wife's security team tried to burn down my barn last night. 2 of them are in custody, and now she seems to be missing." "This situation has gotten out of hand," Julian said, his voice tightly controlled. "I'd like to meet with you privately to discuss a resolution that would benefit us both." Sheriff Ellis shook his head firmly, indicating I should refuse. "Any discussion should include law enforcement at this point," I replied. "Your wife's whereabouts are now a police matter." There was a long pause before Julian spoke again, his tone hardening. "You have no idea what you've stepped into, Morrison. This could have been simple. You sell your property at a fair price. Everyone wins. Now you've forced complications that cannot be easily resolved. Is that a threat, Mr. Holloway?" "A reality check. My offer to meet stands. Otherwise, things will proceed their natural course." The line went dead. Around 4 p.m., my security system alerted me to movement at the front gate. The camera showed a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulling up to the entrance. The driver's window lowered to reveal Julian Holloway himself. a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair. Before I could respond, Sheriff's vehicles arrived behind Julian's SUV. Sheriff Ellis approached Julian's window and, after a brief conversation, escorted him to one of the sheriff's cruisers. He wasn't in handcuffs, but the firm grip Sheriff Ellis maintained on his arm made it clear this wasn't a voluntary departure. When the sheriff returned to my property, his face was lined with tension. We found Diane's Mercedes abandoned near the old mining road. No sign of her, but her phone was in the vehicle, along with some disturbing items: a loaded handgun, a file with detailed information about your daily routines, and maps of your property with various locations marked. As evening approached, the sheriff received an urgent call from the search team. After a brief conversation, his expression changed from concern to shock. "They've found something by the creek that runs through your property," he told me. "A device of some kind, partially buried near the water. The hazmat team is on their way." Within an hour, my property had transformed into a command center. When the hazmat team leader finally emerged from the creek bed, his expression was grim beneath his clear face shield. "It's a chemical dispersal device," he reported. "Time to release a cocktail of industrial pollutants into the water system. If we hadn't found it, the entire watershed would have been contaminated by morning." The implications were staggering. The creek that ran through my property fed into the county reservoir, supplying water to thousands of homes, including Silver. "Creek Estates, environmental terrorism," Jessica murmured beside me. "But why would Diane sabotage her own community's water supply?" Sheriff Ellis approached us with the answer. "Because Julian Holloway recently purchased controlling interest in Mountain Pure Water Systems, a private utility company. They've been lobbying the county to privatize the water infrastructure for months." "Create a crisis, then sell the solution," I said, understanding the scheme. "Contaminate the water, then step in as the savior with a private alternative." As we processed this revelation, a commotion erupted near the creek. Deputies were converging on an area downstream. Sheriff Ellis hurried toward them, returning minutes later with news. "They've found Diane," he said. "She appears to have slipped while setting the device. The creek's running high from recent rains, and the current carried her downstream. She's alive but injured, trapped on a rocky outcropping about half a mile from here." The rescue operation took hours. When they finally brought Diane Holloway up from the ravine, she was barely conscious, her designer clothing torn and muddied, her leg clearly broken. As paramedics loaded her into an ambulance, she caught sight of me standing with Jessica and Sheriff Ellis. Her eyes focused with surprising clarity, filled with a hatred so intense it was almost palpable. The aftermath unfolded rapidly over the following days. Julian Holloway, confronted with evidence of the water contamination plot, turned on his wife completely, claiming he knew nothing of her radical methods. But financial records and emails told a different story, revealing a calculated conspiracy that extended to several county officials. Jessica's expose in the Silver Creek Gazette blew the case wide open, detailing years of corruption, intimidation, and fraud. Residents who had been bullied out of their homes came forward with their stories. Officials who had taken bribes were exposed and resigned in disgrace. The Silver Creek Estates HOA was placed under emergency receivership pending a complete investigation. 3 months later, I stood on my front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. The barn had been repaired, the horses were thriving, and the property felt truly like home for the first time. Frank Whitman sat beside me in a rocking chair I'd built for him, nursing a glass of bourbon. "Never thought I'd see the day," the old rancher mused. Diane facing criminal charges, Julian's company under federal investigation, and half the county commission replaced in the special election. "All because they picked the wrong person to intimidate," I replied. In the distance, I could see new fencing being installed along the boundary between my ranch and Silver Creek Estates. not to separate, but to properly delineate. The new Homeowners Association, democratically elected and with strictly limited powers, had reached out to establish respectful relations with neighboring properties. Sometimes standing your ground means more than protecting your own interests. Sometimes it means standing up for an entire community against those who would abuse power for personal gain. And as I watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, I knew that was worth every moment of the fight. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.